And there are some ways in which, as human beings, we have lots and lots of cognitive biases. We're at a point now where we are intentionally ceding control to machines to do things that they've never done before. The more we automate, the higher the burden of proof that we are automating things that we want to automate and not automating things we don't. Do you take that to mean that that is the way that we should be making decisions and that's the way the world should be? These models can make decisions with far greater consequence, but it's on us. And we are in the efficiency moment right now. Like, that is really what everybody's thinking about. Facts can't defend themselves against being misconstrued.
Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Sam Knowles. And joining us today is Susan Etlinger, a globally recognized expert in digital strategy with a focus on artificial intelligence, responsible AI, data, and the future of work. In the 4 years immediately before we recorded this episode in August 2025, Susan was Senior Director, Strategy and Thought Leadership for Azure AI at Microsoft and host of the AI Innovation Podcast, Leading the Shift. Susan first came to global attention with her 2014 TED at IBM Talk, What do we do with all this big data? And it's the themes and perspectives of this talk that we're going to focus on today. Although it's more than a decade since this talk first aired, it remains as fresh, vibrant, and inspiring as ever. This is no mean feat given what's happened in the world of technology, particularly with the advent of mass availability AI tools in the intervening years. The talk has cranked up 1.5 million views and has been translated into 25 languages to boot. With a Bachelor of Arts in Rhetoric from the University of California at Berkeley, Susan grew up in the Golden State, the daughter of an accomplished composer of music and an entertainment lawyer. Her insatiable curiosity to find out the why behind the what initially alarmed her parents, to the extent that they considered referring her to a psychiatrist because of her passion for reading books. But they learned to tolerate that passion, nay, obsession, one that still afflicts her to this day. And when we first met in person in London in September 25, we recommended 6 bits of freeware to each other. Before joining Microsoft, Susan spent more than a decade as a tech industry analyst with the research consultancy Altimeter, identifying, researching, and analysing the strategic, process, policy, and ethical implications of AI and data on business and society. She's a senior fellow in global policy at the Canadian think tank, the Centre for International Governance Innovation, and in 2020 was named one of the 100 brilliant women in AI ethics. It is great to have you with us, Susan. Welcome to Data Malarkey.
Thank you, Sam. It's such a pleasure to be here.
Now, first off, can you tell me if that's a good narrative of how you've got to where you are today? Is there anything I've missed out or got wrong? This is your chance to put the record straight.
Well, it was a terrifying narrative, I have to say. I think the only thing you maybe missed were the names of my early pets, which frankly, many of them I've forgotten. Sorry to say.
Very good. Well, I'm delighted to be so comprehensive. I offer this service as professional bio writer to my guests. Now, before we get down and dirty with data, I want to ask you a question that's designed to get to the heart of what makes you, you. And it doesn't necessarily ask you to tell us about the 9 to 5. So tell me, Susan, if you would, how do you spend your time?
So I am someone who loves to be busy. And when I'm busy, it makes it harder to have perspective. So I find myself lately in this balancing act between actively doing things and stopping and reading, watching films, spending a lot of time at museums lately. I'm spending a lot of time at museums. In fact, you had recommended to me the Temple of Mithras in London, and I did go to that, and that was phenomenal. So I've been trying to take this moment to really sort of get some perspective on where we are. And I do that in the ways that make sense to me. So I walk, I read, I spend time with my family, I spend time with my friends. I'm talking to lots of people, and it feels really good. It's a good way to spend the summer.
Very good, very good. Well, very good. Listen, as I say, when we met, it felt like you didn't think it was an affliction. It was this desire to have your nose always in a book, and I'm delighted with the recommendations you gave. So thank you for that. Now, listen, I don't usually stop the flow of a podcast once we're underway. But I'm going to suggest to our viewers, our listeners, that if they're not familiar with your talk, our conversation might make a little bit more sense if they watched it. So, and indeed, even if you have watched it, you don't have to do this, loyal listener. But even if you have, why not give it another look? You could hit pause on this podcast, and we'll see you back here in 12 and a half minutes' time. So, did anybody do that? No, they probably rolled straight on. Welcome back. Now, first off, Susan, could you, for those who didn't follow that instruction, could you give us the elevator pitch summary of your talk? What do we do with all this big data? I particularly, when I first saw it some time ago, I particularly like the fact that you use a lowercase little b and a little d for big data in the title. But can you tell us the tenor of your talk?
So first off, TED named the talk. I actually had forgotten to name it. I mean, which is the honest truth. And the little B and the little D are house style, I believe, for the TED organization. So I can't take credit for that. But what I was trying to do with that talk was explore something that I'd been thinking a lot about, which was with an incredible just sort of influx of different data types. And if you think back to 10 or so years ago, we were in that moment, and technologists in the room will know this, when everybody was talking about big data. And of course, that is an artifact of the internet and all the different ways in which the internet enabled us to collect all sorts of different data types. And so I wanted to take a moment and think about what does that actually mean? And how should we be thinking about that data? And how do we understand it and how do we use it? Because there are some, I would say some kind of precedents for how we use data that are productive and good and accrue to benefit. And there are some ways in which, as human beings, we have lots and lots of cognitive biases. And so I wanted to explore that through some personal stories and also through some scholarship and other sources.
Now, at the start of the talk, you frame the data debate as a battle between George Orwell and Aldous Huxley, between data holding us prisoner and data rotting our brains with trivia, between, as you so eloquently put it, Big Brother watching you and you watching Big Brother. I think that's one of the killer lines, absolutely. In the past 11 years, would you say that, let's characterize it as social media and AI, have taken us down the captive route, the trivial route, or both?
Yeah. Well, first of all, the sort of that framing, that Huxley Orwell framing, actually comes from Neil Postman, "Amusing Ourselves to Death," and that I believe is from 1985. I may be wrong, but I believe that's from 1985. So or around that time. So about 40 years ago. And I was really struck by that idea because, of course, and I'm, by the way, this is no shade to the reality TV watchers. I myself have been guilty of doing that sort of thing. And I thought it was a really interesting way to think about the moment that we were in. Now, of course, I'm not a binary thinker, so it's not an either or. I do think that there are aspects of both, though, that continue to be really relevant for us. So on the Orwell side, that sort of, question of the more data we have, does that accrue to more surveillance? Does that have impacts on individual freedoms? Are those impacts unevenly distributed? The answer is, of course, yes, 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 and yes. And then on the Huxley side, I didn't mean to sound or want to sound like a sort of prim and proper second grade teacher, but there was a question about sort of what does it mean when we have all of this content, which of course writers and artists and creatives of all type, I think, loathe that word. But what happens when we have all this content? And is that a path that we want to be going down? And if it is for our own entertainment, that's fine. We can amuse ourselves, perhaps not to death, but we can amuse ourselves. But how should we be thinking about these two things in contrast to each other? So I was just sort of taking Postman's idea and running the present through it, at least at that point.
And we'll talk plenty more about AI. I have no doubt Data Malarkey podcasts often talk a lot about AI, but do you see an acceleration of kind of flywheel effect of the mass availability of AI tools in the last 2.5 years, 3 years?
Oh, of course. I mean, I think we all do. And I think it's fairly settled that this is a significant, massive shift in the way that we use technology. Simply because we're at a point now where we are intentionally ceding control to machines to do things that they've never done before. Now, we have been ceding control to machines for a very long time, or at least sharing control with machines for a very long time. And so, when you get into a car and you're driving, never mind autonomous vehicles, but when you're driving, that's an act of faith. When you get onto an airplane, uh, unless you're a pilot, you're ceding control, at least to a machine and to the person or people operating that machine. And so we've always been in this sort of precarious relationship with control and technology, and I think that continues. And so I think we're at a point where we are making some very intentional, hopefully intentional decisions about how we want to use that control, where we want to cede that control, and what are the impacts, both positive and negative, of sharing control, ceding control with technology. Personally, I think that there are tremendous opportunities with AI and with data, and there are some just really beautiful use cases out there around health and urban planning and all sorts of other things. But like any powerful technology, we just have to be intentional about it.
Very good. No, I'm absolutely with you there. Now, thinking about data and the bigness of big data, and what both large language models and other tools go on to generate using that data, um, I, I'm always drawn back to the line that Nate Silver used in the introduction to The Signal and the Noise when he talks about the data have no way of speaking for themselves. We speak for them. We imbue them with meaning. Indeed, it's a line that was so powerful that the Cambridge professor of statistics, David Spiegelhalter, previous guest on Data Malarkey, he repeated it in the verbatim in the preface to his 2019 book, The Art of Statistics. Tell us, Susan, where you stand from your West Coast perspective on the issue of data or people creating meaning. I know meaning making and creating meaning is at the heart of your talk.
Yeah, I mean, in the talk, actually did say data doesn't create meaning. We do. I don't know whether that predates or postdates Nate Silver. So I will just say that we were certainly on the same wavelength when it comes to constructing meaning out of data. But we're not alone in this. I mean, we've been making meaning from data since the beginning of time, since early mathematics, and we've always been trying to understand the world using data, um, whether or not that data comes in digital form. And so this isn't new. I don't think of that as an insight. I think of it as kind of a reminder, really, more than anything else.
You say that we make meaning out of different types of data by applying context to these different types of data, images, text, video, and audio. I'm interested particularly in large language models. And a recent guest on the podcast, Chris Summerfield, the Oxford professor of cognitive neuroscience, talked a lot about the very real similarities between the neural networks that we're creating and those that sit between our ears, and also the very real differences that we take in information in all sorts of different ways. Do you think that the fact that many of including the large language models, make use of text and text alone, guessing the next token in the chain, do you think that's likely to limit their potential, or do you think that's a mischaracterization?
Mm. Well, far be it from me to contradict an Oxford professor. So I'm not going to do that. But I will say that there are many different types of models. And so there are language models. There are language models that have a relative, let's say, ability to analyze visual input. And then there are models that have nothing to do with language whatsoever. So it's kind of a complex answer. I do think that we also have to think about what is training those models and where that data come from. Right. And so if that data come from the internet, then we're talking about a relatively prescribed number of languages. And of course, we have thousands of languages in the world. We have places in the world that do not have the same level of digital access that we do here in the Western world, or at least in the global north. And so by virtue of the fact that the data training the underlying models is constrained, that will constrain the output as well. Now, that said, there's a tremendous amount of innovation in model development going on. Um, and there are many efforts underway at universities and elsewhere, and NGOs to try to include more languages. And there's some really interesting work going on in South Africa. There's interesting work going on really all around the world to try to include more languages and include more perspectives. Because when you think about the fundamental inputs of large models, they're coming from the internet, right? They're coming from Reddit. They're coming from all of the sort of published information that is out there and available on the internet. And that doesn't necessarily represent the full reality. Now, over time, I do think it will improve. But, by virtue of the fact that we're still 3 years into the generative AI, let's say revolution or whatever you want to call it, inflection point, there's still plenty more to do.
Yeah, no, I'm with you there. Although I think I'm probably signed up to the class action against Meta for including the content from my books. I'm quite pleased that there may be some tiny hand shaping what is put out. But thinking of AI in particular, in your talk, you say we can process exabytes of data at lightning speed, and we have the potential to make bad decisions for, more quickly, efficiently, and with more impact than we ever did in the past. I think I can guess your answer to the next question, but my next question is, to what extent do you feel that AI is exacerbating this problem, maybe particularly in the case of bias?
Well, it's interesting. There's a lot of very good work going on with bias right now and understanding bias. And of course, we're talking about social bias, not statistical bias, which is just a natural feature of statistics, right? All analysis has a bias. Um, but here we're talking about unintended or unwanted consequences. Um, and in the case of making bad decisions faster, uh, what I would say is that the more we automate, the higher the burden of proof that we are automating things that we want to automate and not automating things we don't. And so if you think about the large technology companies, all of them, most of them, have really sophisticated processes for bias remediation, for preventing things like prompt injections, jailbreaks of models, and all sorts of things that human beings will do. And then also for trying to understand what might be in the data that might reflect a version or a vision of reality that isn't the reality we want to live in. So let's just talk about demographics, for example. If you break down any group of humans into a demographic group, you're going to have minoritized groups, right? You're going to have minoritized groups based on race, based on age, based on political affiliation, military service, religion, all sorts of things. Do you take that to mean that that is the way that we should be making decisions and that's the way the world should be? Or do you want to augment that data with enough data to reflect the reality that we are actually striving for, right? And that would, because, algorithms have no notion of fairness. They have no notion of ethics. They have no notion of human desire. And so we just want to make sure, and I think, the people who are working on this technology want to make sure that we're reflecting a version of the world that is a version of the world we want to live in. So, yes, unconstrained, these models can make decisions with far greater consequence, but it's on us, actually, to make the decisions about how we want them to function.
You make me think. I absolutely. You make me think of some of the work of, way pre-generative AI of Malcolm Gladwell,
Mhm.
looking at the decisions made by judges first thing in the morning versus when they're approaching lunchtime.
Right.
Not based on their inherent racial or class or gender orientation prejudices. No, just whether they're hungry or not, or the ability for super experienced consultant radiologists to look at scans and spot early signs of cancer, and the way that that those types of being a bit tired, being a bit hungry or hangry, just a kind of out of it. But you've used the words several times, and it makes me kind of stop my tracks when you talk about intentionality. We're this inflection point where we're intentionally ceding control to machines. It's up to us to get this right, and I guess the problem always is kind of who guards the guards when it's dollars that really kind of speak. Who guards the guards? I think we've seen in the case of social media, it's kind of there are no guards.
Well, hello there. It's your host Sam here. Now, I won't keep you for long. If you've been inspired by what you've been listening to today, and you'd like to find out what type of data storyteller you are, why not go to our Data Storytelling Scorecard? Just follow the link to data-storytelling.scoreapp.com. That's score app with 2 P's. Answer 12 simple questions, and you'll instantly be served with a scorecard that tells you exactly what type of data storyteller you are. Now, back to the action and our brilliant guest.
But with, I want to think a little bit about kind of data and machine learning, and also refer back to what I thought was just a fantastic and surprising part of that TED talk. But with data and machine learning, when assessments and analytics overvalue one metric and undervalue others, trouble is never far away. You talk about that with great passion. Could you illustrate what you mean by this with reference to your son's story, and particularly how he used search to make sense of the world?
Yeah, absolutely. So, just for context, when I did the talk, my son was actually 11 years old, and he's autistic. He's 22 now, and it's interesting because at the time, he was just at that age where I really was starting to pull back from writing or speaking about him because he needed his privacy. He was a tween, and that was important. And so when this opportunity came up to do the talk, I had a chat with him and I asked him, is it okay with you if I talk about something that happened when you were 3? And he said, sure. And so the story is that, when he was young, he was scoring very low on sort of all sorts of developmental evaluations. And, there were it was just a stressful time. And one day I found him at the computer and he wasn't doing a lot of the things that are sort of developmentally appropriate right at that point. One of them is asking questions. Asking questions is actually one of the most fundamental developmental milestones you can have. So is he asking questions? No, he was not asking questions. And one day I find him at the computer and he's typing into a search box, a Google search box, and he's got this, the screen is full of photographs of women, and we had safe search on, so nobody can worry about that. But photographs of women. I said, Isaac, what are you doing? And I look at the box and he's typed WIMEN. And so I said, what are you doing? And he's like, typing on the computer. Obviously, Mom, right? And so I hit the back button a few times and he was looking for men, bus, school, and then computer, which was, he spelled CPYUTR, which at age almost 4 years old, I thought was pretty good. So what it taught me, and I talk about this in the talk, was that he absolutely was hitting that developmental milestone. He just wasn't hitting it in a conventional way, right? He was asking questions, but because his language at that point was not developed enough, he was not able to articulate the questions in a way that would get the answer that he wanted. And so he just asked something that would give him the answer that he needed. And like that, I thought was incredibly resourceful. So I thought about that as a way of saying, if we are overvaluing sort of normative communication and undervaluing people's ability to get a job done, what are we doing? And actually, on the Leading the Shift podcast, I interviewed Hiren Shukla from Ernst & Young, who runs the Neurodiversity Center of Excellence there. And he was talking about a program that they have where they hire all sorts of people, including developers, many of whom are non-speaking. And those developers are extraordinary, and they're able to do extraordinary things simply because EY is not expecting them to communicate in what would be a sort of normative way in the workplace. And I just think that's tremendous, and a tremendous sort of example of our responsibility of figuring out when someone has, quote unquote, a communication deficit, is perhaps that communication deficit equally on the side, on our side as well? And what can we do to bridge that gap?
Great story. You make me think of a previous guest on the podcast, Professor Simon Baron-Cohen, University of Cambridge, set up the Autism Research Centre many years ago, talking about the fact that kind of very similar programs, getting people from across the autistic and Asperger's spectrum into work. The fact that traditional interviews often don't work for people, particularly even with high functioning autism, don't work. But also, what does an employer want an employee to do? They want them to do the job for which they're hiring them to do, and extraordinary problem solving, extraordinary kind of levels of complexity of coding. What you don't really want them to do is to be able to, play past the orange or hit one another with balloons at the office party, and yet that seems to be the way that people are hired. Particularly maybe pre-AI hiring, holding eye contact during an interview. So no, that EY program sounds fantastic, and it's a lovely echo with what Simon was saying. Now, you're a scholar of rhetoric, and I sense that you share my passion for at least some parts of some of the ancient Greek philosophers. I'm a particular fan of quite a lot of, not all of, Aristotle, and some bits of the way that Socrates is mediated to us through Plato. I know we don't know anything about what Socrates actually said. I often think of, maybe not in a 50 Shades of Grey sense, but I often think of Plato as being like kind of fan fiction writer, right? He's just recording what his heroes said. I'm a big fan of the Socratic paradox, that he's said to have said many times, all that I know is that I know nothing, when he was setting out a new line of inquiry. Do you think, in terms of navigating our way through the big data minefield, do you think that kind of that Socratic position is a good starting point?
I do. I will quibble with characterizing me as a scholar. However, I think that there are plenty of other people out there who know way more than I do about rhetoric. But that said, I do. I think that humility is incredibly important at the time that we're in, right? And the humility to recognize that we have this intensely powerful set of technologies that can describe and affect us in ways that we haven't thought about, and in ways that we do need to think about. And if you just go back to an analog, right? Here's an analog. One of them is the car, the automobile. There are lots of ways in which you can think about the automobile and the trajectory of the automobile, and sort of recognize what moment we're in and maybe what kinds of questions we should be asking. So, in the early days of the automobile, what happens if a bunch of people get in front of a whiteboard, or at that point, I suppose, a chalkboard, and think about what are all the things that could happen that would not be, productive, that would not be good for society, right? When are accidents, traffic congestion, air pollution, blah, 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 blah. I think it took 70 years to put seatbelts in cars, right? We can do better than that. Like 70 years ago was Alan Turing asking if machines could think. So like 70 plus, right? So we have this opportunity. On the other hand, and so then there were efficiencies, right? So we have cars, then we have roadways. We have roadways, then we have faster transportation, and then we get refrigeration, and we have refrigerated trucks, and we can bring fresh food to people. And then things can happen, for example, that are not just about efficiency. And we are in the efficiency moment right now. Like, that is really what everybody's thinking about. Let's take cost out of the system. Let's just, let's get squeeze as much productivity as we can. On the other hand, I think you just came back from New England, right? You drove from place to place. You had what might be called a road trip. Back at the turn of the 20th century, did people think about automobiles and road trips and just the sheer pleasure of being in a car with people that you love and playing games and listening to music? I mean, that's a beautiful thing too. So I guess what I'm arguing for, to the point of nausea probably, is why don't we think about some of the changes that we've seen in technology in our lifetimes and before our lifetimes, And why don't we learn from those? And by the way, there's an entire, there's an entire field of study, around technology and social impact that can help us better understand and think through the kinds of questions we should be asking. And so fundamentally, I think we should come to this with a combination of humility that we don't know everything, of question answering, and then also a sense of purpose around the fact that this technology, as powerful as it is in some ways a gift and in some ways a weapon. And, Brad Smith, the president of Microsoft, famously wrote a book called Tools and Weapons. And, I subscribe to that idea that it is a tool, it is a weapon, and we need to be really intentional about the way we think about it.
Very good. Now, listen, in your talk, you talk about former US President and former governor of your state, Ronald Reagan, attracting unfair ridicule for describing facts as stupid things. He was misquoting John Adams' description of them as stubborn. But you argued that Reagan may, in fact, with his malapropism, have dispensed some accidental wisdom. Can you explain why?
Yeah, I mean, at the time, I said it in kind of sort of a whimsical example. It was sort of a whimsical anecdote, right? Because what I meant was that facts can be a little bit stupid in that they like data, have no agency. And of course, we're living in a world now where even the sheer existence of facts is sometimes disputed. And that is something that I hadn't anticipated 10 years ago. Maybe I had a glimmer, but certainly not to the point where it is today. And so what I meant was that facts can't argue for themselves. Facts can't defend themselves against being misconstrued. And that, I think, it was troubling to me at the time. It's more troubling to me now.
Now, you place special emphasis on asking hard questions to move past simply counting things, to make sense of data, to enable us to answer those questions that I think are thrown about a bit, but I think are the most important ones of kind of so what and now what? What do the data mean and what do we do as a result? You also put a real high bar, and I'm totally with you on critical thinking skills. Imagine that your next role was to take charge of education in the age of AI. What would be the 3 most important classes that you would insist that everybody took?
History. And, my husband's a historian, so he will laugh if I say history. Which history? What history? What period? What place? What thing? But history. Statistics, because people should understand how probabilistic systems work. And okay, so the next one is a split between learning about inferencing models and how they work, and a little bit of sociology and anthropology as well. So I'm picking 4. Okay, I'll put social sciences in a big bucket, and the social scientists will be mad. But there's something to be said for we need to understand where we've come from. We need to understand how data work and how statistics work. I mean, this is just, it's critically important because we're moving from a deterministic society or way of thinking into a probabilistic one. And some industries natively understand this. So you could sit in front of a room of actuaries and say, oh, well, statistical probability is really important. And they'll boo you out of the room because because it's so obvious. But it's different for retail. It's different for manufacturing. Manufacturing is really about precision. Health and life sciences, they're a mix, right? They're a mix of probabilistic around sort of, for example, disease and very deterministic around how, around other characteristics, right? And so I think, when it comes down to it, we need to understand how the technology works. We need to understand how probability works, and we need to understand where we come from. And if we understand those 3-ish things, I think we'll be in pretty good shape.
Listen, it was just me putting the artificial constraint of
thanks.
of the random number 3. You're very welcome to all 4.
I like odd numbers.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Me too. But it was exemplified kind of on a daily basis during COVID right around the world. I mean, maybe less in some places where things were done slightly better, shall we say, I don't know, South Korea, Germany, New Zealand. But this inability to understand, my cat Quincy's tail has arrived. The inability to understand the difference between relative and absolute risk, for example. I mean, a
Yes.
relatively banal statistical point, but that inability to understand that meant that one could suddenly get all kind of range of protest, not even for libertarian reasons, because of this failure either to explain it from leaders and their advisors, and also the inability to understand it. Now, it may or may not take us. Well, we may stay back in those gloomy COVID times. But as we draw to a close, I wondered if you could tell me what's the worst misuse of data that you've ever witnessed during your career.
Oh. So I can't think of a single, and by saying I can't think of a single one doesn't mean I can't think of any. I think so. I'm just going to give you a general answer, and I think the answer is sloppy uses of data. Just in other words, just using it to prove a point you've already, to prove a theory you already have. Now, that could be called validation, and that's a good thing. But unscientific uses of data, those are what scare me. But I want to pick up on a thread that you just mentioned, which is, around the pandemic. Before the pandemic, someone I will not mention who had recently traveled to, I think it was Japan, and came back and said, it's so interesting, this way before COVID, said, it's so interesting how many people on the train and walking down the street are wearing surgical masks. It's fascinating. They must be really worried about getting sick. And I'd actually experienced this before. And I said, well, no. They're not worried about, maybe they're worried about getting sick, but they're more worried about getting other people sick. And the answer was, oh, and so I think one of the things I don't want to forget about is how culturally determined all of this conversation is, right? On sort of our own personal lived experience. And when you think about the ways in which technologies like AI are being used, you have to consider, the cultural inputs and the cultural environment in which you live. And in many cases, and this is, I think, one of the worst misuses of data has to do with being just immune to that, right? Not paying attention, not thinking it through, and not being inclusive enough in your question and in your questions or in your process.
Very good, very good. Sloppy use of data. I think all of our listeners could name many sloppy uses of data. Thank you for that. And last kind of topic question: if you could write your talk again, what would you change with the benefit of hindsight, and why?
The main thing I would change is I probably wouldn't have spent so much time on smokeless tobacco. When I watch it now, I just think, oh, God, I was so naive. And, that was really important research. And just for context for anybody listening who hasn't seen the talk, there's a really interesting study that was done by some folks in Chicago around how people talked about quitting smoking on Twitter. And they were doing it because they were trying to understand sort of what are some of those signals that you don't get from a survey, right? How do people actually talk about their process of trying to quit smoking when quote, nobody's watching, but everybody's watching? What are the things that they say? And there were a lot of really interesting findings from that. But I didn't imagine that vaping would be such a big deal. So that's one thing. So that's what I would change. I also think that I would have come down harder on and I hate this, I don't hate the word ethics, but I find the word ethics really imprecise because it is, again, so culturally determined and so hard to, operationalize for the folks out there who are in operations roles. I would have come down harder on that because with some more specific recommendations, because I do think that we've made tremendous strides in the last year or last 10 years around trying to put guardrails around this technology much more quickly than the 70 years it took us to put a seatbelt in a car. And so maybe I would have been a little bit harder on that, but mostly it would have been about smokeless tobacco.
I wasn't expecting that. Very good. Now, finally, Susan, where can our listeners and our viewers find out about you and your work online and social media?
Yeah, I am, I'm on all the usual socials, and I'm in the process of spinning up a website, but that's a little bit. So you can find more for now. Come find me on LinkedIn.
Very good. We'll include a link to your profile in the show notes. I will, of course, include a link to your TED at IBM talk from 2014. Thank you so much for your time today, Susan. If only there were more people with your approach and your wisdom, I think there'd be rather less malarkey in the world of big data and rather more data-driven common sense. Susan Etlinger, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It was so much fun.